Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Assessing New Prospects for Managed Services. My name is Courtney Swift, and I'm our Marketing Communications Manager here at Continuum. I'll be here to go over some housekeeping items and introduce our fantastic speaker. Today, you'll be hearing from Alex Hoff, co-founder and vice president of sales and product at Auvik, as he explores deep network visibility so you can spot problems proactively, how to identify upsell and expansion opportunities, and increasing your profitability with right-sized contracts. Alex spearheads Auvik's channel program, working closely with MSPs to identify growth opportunities for their businesses. Prior to co-founding Auvik, Alex was senior product manager at Sandvine, a publicly traded company that sells networking solutions to some of the biggest telecom companies in the world to help them manage their network resources more efficiently. While there, he built Sandvine's usage management product line. And just to go over a few housekeeping items before we get things started, we will be recording the webinar, so you'll receive an email with that as well as the presentation slides in the coming days. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit them through the question box, and we will have a short Q&A portion at the end. Now to get things started, I'm going to hand things over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Courtney. So if you think of Auvik, most people think of us as network management. I'll tell you a little bit of the background, but today we're going to talk about how you can use Auvik in the context of prospecting. So when you first walk into a managed services opportunity with your SMB client, how can you use Auvik to help better understand what's going on, get a clearer picture so you can ultimately deliver a better service? So let me give you a little bit of background on ourselves. So we've been at this for 6-7 years now. We launched the product in 2015 to the MSP channel. We're 100% channel focused. We're Canadians, so if you take a look at our, everyone asked the same question, so I will get in front of this one. They ask what the name Auvik is, and it's actually an Inuit word for igloo. If you look on top of our logo there, the little purple swoosh there is actually an igloo, and so we play on that Canadian theme hard. We've got a polar bear mascot named Nanook, but I thought, you know, as I talk about the company, I wanted to touch on one of the reports that we just released, because it is very important to you as an MSP dealing with proactive monitoring as well as that assessment piece. So we analyzed our partner base to understand what type of gear is deployed in the MSP channel. And so we looked across the partner base. We figured out that the median ISP, so a typical MSP, has a client with 2 different network vendors on it. So let's just talk about that for a second. So an MSP has a client, it's got a vendor for its firewall, it's got a vendor for its switching or Wi-Fi, so on and so forth. But you know, the role of an MSP is to manage a portfolio of clients, and you're constantly going out there prospecting. So what we found was the most typical MSP managed up to 4 different networking vendors across its install base of clients. And we've seen instances where MSPs had to deal with 10, even 20 different networks. And the reason different network vendors, and the reason that's important to you is because of the massive diversity in types of management techniques, CLIs, how you monitor it, and that's really complicated. So I'll go through a little bit of overview on prospecting and how you can use the tool, but I want you to come back and remember that when you're looking at a network, there's always going to be so many different vendors in there, and it's important to understand what they look like, because when you do that assessment, you need to get a complete snapshot of what's going on in order to ultimately decide how you're going to deliver the right service. Just a fun fact on that, we actually found that Cisco networking is dominant in the switching space, and from a firewall, SonicWall has 50% of the market share. So that was kind of neat, at least across our install base. So if we dive right in, so why use Auvik for network assessment? So let's not talk about us for a second. Let's talk about the concept of a network assessment. So your sales rep has been diligently prospecting and working with this client, and you've got the opportunity to walk in and showcase your services. You know, you finally got that face-to-face where you're going to go in, do a proof of concept, or get an understanding, whether that's a little bit of an ongoing gig, or we're just doing a quick one-time assessment. One of the most important things there is to actually understand what's going on. I've heard so many times stories of MSPs walking into an office that's just, been there for 10, 15 years, and they have no idea what's going on. They'll hear examples of people saying, well, we've got some switches somewhere in our office. You should go find that. And you hear people telling me that that they had to trace cables. They would find switches hiding in ceiling tiles, all sorts of crazy stuff. But from an MSP's perspective, that's work, right? You got to go figure all that stuff out. You can't really rely on the documentation provided by the client. You need to go figure out, do your due diligence to understand it. And so largely when you're walking into an environment, you want to get a complete understanding of the inventory, both from a physical asset point of view, their PCs, their servers, which you use Continuum for, understanding their backup strategy, everything. You want to understand what their network looks like and how it's performing. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the following slides. But largely, why do you care about this? You want to accurately quote. So I have a story from one of the partners I personally worked with early on in the development of Auvik, and we were prospecting one of his manufacturing clients. Turns out the information he was given was only for the corporate IT network. So we discovered their network infrastructure was predominantly Cisco, all was good. We figured out the credentials and everything was great. But then I got into this, I would call it an argument with the MSP saying, hey, there's more devices out here. This is why your map doesn't look perfectly accurate. You said you guys wanted a layer one topology, but I'm showing you on this console that there's a whole bunch of other stuff we're missing. And we got into a discussion, and ultimately we discovered that the subnets that were used for the manufacturing part of the client's business weren't in the system yet. And so we discovered those, and ultimately we built up this perfect layer one topology map. But that's really important to you as an MSP, because what we learned during that exercise was the network was almost twice as big as we expected. And if you're building out your services, whether you're doing per user or quoting per device, I mean, you don't want to go back a couple of days after closing the business finding out that you were off by a factor of 2. If you miss one device, I'm sure you can figure that out, but you don't want to be underwater, right? So you want to put together a services agreement at some point that ultimately delivers profitable service to you and making sure that you're aligned from the client's perspective. And so, as you're doing these assessments, we say close more of the right prospects. What does the right prospect mean? I've heard great stories of MSPs walking into an environment, showcasing their expertise, their tool chain, going in there and closing the business, and fairly quick sales cycles. That's awesome. It's just the client is just in that right mindset and everything's great. I've also heard the opposite, where they don't truly understand and value what the MSP is doing. They go in there, they do their assessment, they're just paying for a one-time assessment. Ultimately, the MSP is trying to get them onto a services contract because it's better for everybody. Allow them to focus on what they do and allow the MSP to focus on their core competency. But one of the stories I was told was they did their assessment, they had used Auvik, and they discovered the network. And during that exercise, they were looking at the firewall. The firewall had I don't remember the exact age of it, but it was so old, it was out of warranty, it was no longer getting new firmware, and they had made a recommendation that if we were to move ahead, that we should upgrade this firewall and swap it out. And the client said no. And so let's think about that for a second. So the first recommendation that the MSP is making is met with resistance. And it's like, well, wait a second. If they're not taking this recommendation, what type of recommendations do you think will be taken later? And if they're not taking your recommendations, well, then you're going to have to deal with this legacy infrastructure that it's on its last legs, deal with the legacy processes that they don't want to change. And ultimately, as the MSP, you're going to either be spending way too much energy on this client, or you're going to be delivering a bad experience, and neither of which is great. So ultimately, yeah, you just want to look like a superstar. And so one of our partners out in the UK had told us the story about, during an assessment, looking for some aging switching infrastructure that they likely needed to understand what needed to be upgraded. But all the client saw was blinky lights. The blinky lights are flashing, and therefore all is good, right? You see everyone's seen an active switch before. It's all sorts of green and yellow lights, like, ooh, whoop-de-doo. But behind the scenes, those devices were maxed out. And so they just needed to have that real-time visibility into that network to be able to say, hey, these ports are maxed out, we're running out of ports, these are the recommendations I'd like you to take. So let's dive into how do you actually use the product. So the first thing that you would do, for those who are familiar with Auvik, this is as simple as just creating a new client and deploying it. But those who aren't familiar with Auvik, as I mentioned, we're in network management. Our je ne sais quoi, our differentiator is really that out-of-box experience. So when you go create a new client in the console, you will go in there, create it, download a collector in the form of a Windows service or a virtual machine, doesn't really matter. And it'll begin this automated process of discovery. This is the first phase of understanding what's out at this client's network. We want to understand what's there so we can start to look for fun / problem or opportunities, I should say, that you can address as part of this network assessment. So my favorite, or maybe not my favorite, one of the most common things, unmanaged switches. A lot of us work in cubicles like myself. When we got a printer at our desk, only one network drop at your cubicle, you say, oh, okay, I'll just go pop out to Best Buy, grab myself a 5-port unmanaged switch. It's 40 bucks, no big deal. Well, that no big deal is not a big deal to you, but other people plug into it. And because these devices aren't exactly designed for speed, you start to see some weird performance problems on the network. People call in and say, hey, it's not working. You're trying to figure out where everything is. The unmanaged switch is hidden between the cubicles and you just have no idea what's going on. So from a management point of view, these are dangerous because they create bottlenecks and you have no visibility into what's going on. So being able to identify these is super powerful. What you don't want to do is trace every cable by hand and figure it out. You want a programmatic system that can go out there and do that very quickly. Access points, right? We've all been in a situation where you walk in to our own office, somewhere else, it's like, the Wi-Fi is not working. I'm tired of this. There's bad signal at my desk. I'm just going to go to Best Buy and pick up an access point. And so identifying these things, there's a huge security risk there because unlikely that they're secured properly, not conforming to the corporate standards, especially if they're in a more sensitive field like healthcare. These are super dangerous. But the average case is they just create a performance problem because often they can, what's the right word here? They can provide their own DHCP, which can cause an outage. They have RF interference, all sorts of nasty stuff for not using the corporate Wi-Fi. The ultimate solution is just go deploy another Wi-Fi access point, not a big deal, but let's use the one that are attached to the real corporate SSIDs. Hidden switches. Yeah, this is the story I told a little bit earlier of stuff hitting in ceiling tiles. Like, you laugh, but we've seen instances where the offices are pretty big and they couldn't get a cable run, so they just plugged a switch in and then put another long cable run just to get that extension. Yeah, that's not awesome because you have no idea what's going on up there and it's hidden. So you just want to understand that both from a from an MSP, I have to manage these things, but also just understanding what's out there as you're assessing and understanding the aged infrastructure. If that thing dies and you didn't know about it, well, you're gonna have to go figure that out, and that's gonna be an expensive truck roll for you. Another one of my favorite things is unauthorized IoT devices, right? More and more devices are IP connected and they're showing up in your network. So while we can't identify all of these, and most platforms actually can't because they literally, all they do is grab an IP address and just connect out to the internet, you can identify the vendors in them. And you can take those vendors because of their MAC address and try and figure what these things are. There's been stories of from our partners telling us about fingerprint scanners on doors that are IP connected. And just because they're running, poor versions of Linux, they may do some bad things on the network, they were causing DHCP storms and ultimately just doing bad things on the network. The solution was really to put them onto a separate subnet or use a higher quality product, but identifying these is part of the assessment. So you just want to have a clear and accurate picture of what's going on. All right, so within the platform, I really wish I could jump in and show you live on our network, but for the sake of a webinar, you'll have to take my word for these screenshots are actually real. This is one of our sandboxes. The first thing you'll want to do is when it's completing its discovery, you go click on a device. If you've got the right credentials in there, and those are the one thing you do need to get from your prospective client, it'll tell you IP addresses, makes, models, firmwares of pretty much all the network infrastructure. As you get to the more, I would say the long upper tail of devices, those IoT devices, you can get, often if they have SNMP, we can get a lot of information. The system's pre-populated with common SNMP community strings that allow you to discover these devices. But realistically, you'll be able to get at least the vendor. And that allows you to see, all the different devices out there, anything that's IP addressable, we should be able to detect and help you understand A, what it is, but B, where it's plugged in at a layer 1 and a layer 2 point of view. So if you're prospecting a very large environment, a 150, 250 employee organization, you start to see more complicated environments with VLANs for voice, VLANs for different data centers, whatever. So that kind of leads me to my next point. Let's ensure that there's enough IP addresses in the environment. And I have a great story about this, but let's just first dig into this. So for those who aren't subnetting wizards, the typical subnet that you'd find on a network is a /24. So it's approximately 255 IP addresses that are available for your clients to get on the network. They're handed out when people come online. So, with all these different IoT devices, bring your own phones, it's going to, I would say, budget 2 to 3 times the number of employees is going to be the number of IP addresses you need. So in a larger environment or a company that's growing quickly, this is not one of the first things people go look at to see if the network is going to have a potential issue. So when you do the assessment, you should be able to figure out what subnets they have today, what's the current size. You can even drill in and see how many IP addresses are currently in use at that time. Now that's important because I've got this awesome story one of our partners shared with us. So he's one of the most proactive MSPs I've spoken with. I have a huge amount of respect for him. However, he had this really weird situation where building maintenance had come into the company that he was responsible, he's the MSP for, and they had swapped out the light bulbs. Now the light bulbs they swapped them out for were IP connected IoT things, and they did this at night, no big deal. But they took the building maintenance guy had access to the Wi-Fi and then set these things up, and they took out a ton of IP addresses because there's so many light bulbs. It consumed the vast majority of the DHCP pool. Not a big deal, right? Well, the next morning when all the employees came to work, their laptops and phones tried to get on the network, but there was no IP addresses left. And so these light bulbs had inadvertently created a denial of a service attack because there was no way for the other people to get onto the network. So oops, right? Now, that's not something that's easily preventable, but having real-time visibility in this situation allowed one of our partners to get in there and identify all these different devices and figure out, oh, okay, it's a DHCP pool thing, or let's put on a different subnet, put a different Wi-Fi. He was able to rectify the situation, but without that visibility, he would have been scrambling because, what's not first on my list of things to check when I'm, on site doing a network assessment? It's not the light bulbs. So that was a very, very interesting use case. And so when you're in the portal, you can kind of see this by looking at the devices, drilling through the inventory pages on the Auvik portal. Ultimately, you can hit that export button and get the full dump of everything, but really it's trying to understand what's out there. Now, to rectify this, the resolution that you would typically recommend to your client if they are approaching that 80–90% limit of the DHCP pool would be to segment it. So maybe put the phones on a separate thing, guest Wi-Fi, corporate Wi-Fi, all should be on different subnets just to make sure you've spread it out. But those are very typical use cases. Other things you can do is decrease the DHCP lease time. That's all done. Typical, I'd say all done. Most people do that in their Active Directory installation. So those are a couple of things that I would look for when doing a network assessment. All right, the ticking time bombs of the network. I love to say networking is like plumbing. When it works, it works. And when it doesn't, people scream. And the network is full of these little things that could potentially go wrong, whether that's as nefarious as a broadcast storm that's just teetering on the brink of disaster, or it's VLAN misconfigurations that, when you move someone's desk, plug in and things don't work. There's all sorts of really weird things that you need to understand about the network. So during that initial assessment, you might build out that network map in the first 15 minutes to an hour, but you start to gather data around the performance of the network as well as the rest of the inventory. You start to see trends. So at midnight, for example, you might be doing backups. And does that cause a bottleneck? Does that cause the CPU to spike to 100% on the firewall? These are the types of ticking time bombs. You need to let the system do its thing and gather the data for at least a couple of days so you can start to spot these trends, spot these problem/opportunities. Some of them could be as simple as just, looking at alerts in the Auvik portal. Oh my God, you got a broadcast storm. Well, that's obvious. That could be really detrimental. Or it could be as simple as, hey, there's high utilization, high CPU. You start to see alerts. You start to see what's happening on the network, and the system is just doing its thing. So, typically what I recommend when you're looking for these ticking time bombs is to honestly just, if there's alerts, great, because those are very obvious, but just to click around, get a feel for what's going on. What are the opportunities to upgrade links from 10 meg to 100 meg to a gig? Are there any ports that have duplex? And I'll talk a little bit about that as we continue through this. All right. Now, one of the reasons most people get called or call an MSP is because the client is tired of the dreaded statement, why is my network slow, right? Everyone's heard this. It's got to be one of the worst questions in the world from an MSP to answer, because it could be the application, it could be the internet, it could be the network, it could be the person's PC, it could be their handheld. Heck, they could just be making things up because they're having a bad day. And so what do we do here, right? There's lots of data that you can use, right? We've all been at home and our internet's not working the way we expected. So we call into our local ISP and say, hey, things aren't working. And you get the usual spiel about, well, have you restarted your modem? And it's like, oh my God, yes, I have. And what you're trying to do is get that ticket escalated right away, because we're all in this space. We all know the basic stuff to try and resolve this ourselves. But to the extent that you can gather data is very powerful, because it tells you, hey, we're seeing 20% packet loss on our internet connection. That's a problem. It's causing our VoIP phones, our VoIP calls to be really poor. And so being able to figure that out, or at least have that data, will allow you to hopefully pinpoint the problem. So you kind of look at this from the outside in. Is the internet having packet loss? Is there really bad latency? These are things you can easily measure. Then we look at the firewall and we're measuring the amount of throughput going through the internet connection. Is it sized appropriately, or is that connection just full? Are we in a failover event? Do we have any asymmetric routing? All sorts of weird things can happen on the outside of the internet. We look at the inside, then it really becomes the devices. Are they maxed out? Are they causing packet loss? Are we seeing tons of packet loss that could be causing these potential slowdowns? Or is it just a utilization problem? If it's not that, then it's typically not the network. Then you could probably point to the actual application or desktop. But again, for those who don't make this part of their onboarding, how would you troubleshoot this today? Would you just start logging devices? It's super time consuming. One of the guys on our team actually used to work for an MSP, and he used to say, he was in a sales capacity. He used to tell us that, when they went into a serious engagement with a prospect trying to bring them onto a managed service commitment, they would invest 5 hours of tech's time to go in and do all these steps by hand. You think about that, that's a fairly significant financial investment. That senior technician that you're sending on site, prospecting is great, right? It's high value if you win, but if, like everything, it's a sales funnel. You don't win every opportunity. And so being able to take that energy and say, take that 5 hours, reduce it down to 2 or 1, that gives you a lot of leverage as you bring on more prospects, or taking that resource and have them focus on existing partners. So, you definitely want to try and get data here, because if the client's engaging you for your services, you ultimately want to take the problem to root cause and showcase your value. So within the portal, there's lots of different screens. We won't spend a ton of time going through that. But when you do your assessment, you should be able to click around on the different interfaces, understanding the performance of the internet connection. So here's, you can see a little chart there measuring transmit and receive packets to the outside interface, but also drilling down, what's the performance of the internet connection, and you can continue to go deeper and deeper into the network. So loops, right? Loops are one of these things that, if it's a really bad loop, oh my God, your network's going down and it's not recovering easily until you correct the loop. But more often than not, there's logical loops. There's layer 2 loops. There's layer 1 loops that have been closed, or I would say the loop has actually been broken because of spanning tree, which is doing the right thing. But these are problems. So if you think about, let's talk about layer 1 first. If there's a layer 1 loop and they're calling you, it's because their network is down. So find the loop, unplug it, no problem. If it's a layer 1 loop that's been stopped by spanning tree, then you're going to start to see, when you do this assessment, that there is a ticking time bomb here. Going back a couple previous slides, that there's an issue that's latent, that if something changes, a switch reboots because you're doing regular maintenance, that could change the entire topology of the network and things could go really wonky. So when you're doing your assessment, just getting that layer one topology, looking at that physical loop on the network is like, ooh, yeah, we should fix that. And no one designs loops in there by default. It's usually there by accident, at least in my experience on SMB networks. From a layer two point of view, we often see loops in the form of different VLANs. So you got a handful of switches where you have a trunk going one direction, a trunk going another direction physically, and both from the VLAN perspective. And from layer one, it's creating a loop, but from layer two, it's perfectly fine, right? That was the way the network was designed. But someone goes in there later and changes the topology, again, that could cause a broadcast storm, taking the network down. And for most people, the documentation of their network is in their head. Most SMBs are not super diligent about, writing all this stuff down and why they did it. And so that's why they're bringing you in. So it's important to understand this so you can make recommendations to either break that loop or put the proper guards in place. The next level up, I would say, is layer three loops. We don't see that a ton in SMB, but one of the issues I spoke to before on the previous slide about the internet connection is the asymmetric routing. So you could have, if you have two internet connections, you could have a default gateway that's sending out one internet connection and have it returning on another internet connection. You can see that in the graphs, but that's not a good thing. That's an asymmetric loop, which can lead to very funky behaviors in certain applications. So that's that's definitely something you want to try and look into during the assessment. So if it's a layer one loop, it's as simple as just looking for that little loop back there and finding that gem and unplugging that cable. So during the assessment phase, that is like taking candy from a baby. During a proactive management phase, when you see that you've got a problem, you need to fix that as quickly as you possibly can. All right, so that's kind of the typical things you would do during a assessment, at least some technologies that you can use, some techniques, some data that you can use to help build that report to try and make the recommendations to either move ahead with a managed services contract or not. Now, there's a couple other things that I want to touch on that actually one of our partners had shared with us that, they work with a lot of security conscious clients and they would go even deeper with the tool. And this was so good that we decided we want to share this as part of this assessment. So it's funny, I think I mentioned earlier that we put a couple default credentials into the platform. I mentioned the SNMP public-private, it's very common. But we also put admin and Cisco, fairly basic username and passwords. The scary thing is that works a lot. And as an MSP, when you're walking in, like that is just a recipe for disaster. If those things are working, anybody could log into a switch, whether it's malware or just some rogue employee doing something silly. I don't want to say nefarious, but they could be doing some, shadow IT trying to fix it themselves, and they can make a huge mistake taking down the network. So obviously, if there's any default creds that are working, you definitely want to make that as one of your top recommendations to put proper usernames and passwords in there, especially if they're in a security conscious industry where they're subject to HIPAA, SOC, geez, the list goes on. So that's one. A less common thing is default VLANs. That's actually part of PCI compliance. You're not supposed to use the default VLAN one on an interface. You should actually put the data network on a data VLAN, put the the public network on a public VLAN, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just to create segregation and accidental leakage from data from one network to another. So if everything's on VLAN one, you basically get on the network and go. Kind of leads me to my next point. If there are physical ports that are not in use, if there are desks in the office and there's no one sitting there, you're supposed to turn those ports off. Now that's not super convenient, but again, if combine that with the default VLAN, anyone can gain physical access to your office, can gain physical access to the network then. So it's not a surefire way, but it's one technique to reduce the risk within it. Going on, kind of building on the credential thing, if there's devices with web UIs enabled where they shouldn't be, typically we see this on phones. That's an opportunity for you to go in there and make a recommendation. Devices that have punched holes in the firewall using UPnP, those aren't good. You want to understand what they are and turn that off. Or devices that have just no login credentials. And so you have typically some older, lower end managed switches that you just log in and you can just gain access. So in those scenarios, It's not a default credential thing. It's just a device that just needs to be swapped out. But again, a lot of this stuff is stuff you can identify. That's kind of more credential based and physical security, but also, yeah, I think I mentioned earlier, ports that are at half duplex, ports that are 100 meg. These are just low hanging fruit opportunities for you to go in there and make recommendations to fix up the network. So very simple example, default password Cisco. This is a partner that shared this screenshot from me. This was one of their clients' networks, and this is what they saw. This was a perfect opportunity for them to say, okay, here, this one super easy takeaway that you can do to better secure your network. So overall, that's kind of how you would use Auvik to do some proactive work when you're doing a network assessment. The intention here of doing that is to get better visibility into the assets that you will hopefully be taking on as part of that managed services contract. So to summarize, it's really about understanding the network risk, I would say, both from the client's perspective, what recommendations need to be taken in order to make the network more stable and so on, or the opposite, what recommendations or lack thereof is the client going to take, so you make sure that your interests are aligned, right? If, as I said earlier, if they don't want to listen to you, then it's not going to be a super successful relationship. So with that, that's how you do network assessments. And so what I'd like to do just to close off there is, if you're working an active opportunity and you think you could benefit from Auvik's tools helping you prospect that client, feel free to reach out. There's a link up on the screen there. And if you book a demo, then we can get in there, help you take a look at that network, hopefully even help you win that client. And if we don't, no matter what, we'll send you a $5 gift card. So with that, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me today. And I'm going to pass it back to Courtney for the live Q&A portion.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. Let's just take a moment. If you do have any questions, you can submit them through the chat. There were a couple that came through, but just want to remind you all, if you do have any questions, to submit them within that question box. Going to one quickly here, Alex, that came in during the presentation. How quickly does Auvik begin mapping out a new network?
Hey, Courtney. It's pretty quick. So when you download that collector, you get it installed, whether it's the Windows service or virtual machine, doesn't really matter. It immediately starts doing its network discovery. So the network discovery is largely sending ICMP packets first to identify the devices on the network, and then as it learns more about the network, it'll start to ask for permission to crawl further and further throughout the organization. So within 15, 20 minutes, you can build a pretty accurate view of that network. You might not have all the credentials handy in that initial network assessment, but through a couple techniques, you should be able to find the firewalls, the switches, the different vendors on that network, and get a pretty accurate view. And then you can refine it by, maybe you have to turn on SNMP on one of the devices because they forgot, the type of stuff that might take a little bit more time, but you'll get an idea. Again, 10, 15 minutes of what's happening.
Awesome, thanks. This next one here is kind of like a two-parter. Is there a cost to use for the assessment? And then what about several locations? Do you need to go to each location?
Okay, let's talk about the location one first, because that builds on the last question,
Yeah.
the last question and answer there. As I said, you just when you deploy that collector, it's going to look at the local subnet, and then it asks for permission to continue to crawl. If there is a remote location that is connected via a VPN, then you just have to approve that remote subnet, and it does its thing automatically. If they are isolated locations, all you have to do is then download a collector and deploy it on a box on that other location. It can be in the same map. You just need a way for the Auvik system to communicate with the devices on the network. So there's lots of different ways to do that. We have a deployment guide that is available on our support website, and that gives you some ideas on the best way to achieve the goal. Your other question there was around the commercial side of things. So the way Continuum and Auvik work together on this is we only charge you, I think the philosophy, we actually love the Continuum model for billing. We look at this and say, hey, when you're out there doing an assessment, a device actually has to be online for 12 days before 12 hours before it counts towards a billable day. And then we count up the number of billable days before you get it counted on your bill. So for example, if you did an assessment and a device was online for half a month, so 14 days, then it would count for half a billable device. A typical network assessment usually is a week or so. And a typical network has 3 or 4 billable devices. So I would imagine that in your subscription, you're going to have a couple free licenses free, and you dedicate that. If not, it'll end up costing you 15, 20 bucks. It's not going to be material. So we try and make it really easy. The partner success organization that we work with here at Auvik and with Continuum can help you with that. So if you're not getting the visibility that you think you need into a prospects network, or you're stumped, can't quite figure out what's going on, our team would be happy to help.
Cool. Thanks so much, Alex. Another question here. How long does it take typically to do like the average network assessment, or does it kind of depend?
Depends on the size of the company, I guess. So if you think of a typical managed services prospect, they're going to be somewhere between 30, 50 employees. If they're smaller than that, it might not be as useful to use Auvik, because I like to joke that if the entire network comes from the Comcast cable modem, then you kind of know what the network looks like. If it's got managed switches, managed routers, firewalls, yeah, it'll take 15 minutes to get that first assessment. But then again, as I mentioned before, you need to refine that.
All right, awesome. Thanks. Just one more reminder, if you guys do have any last minute questions, I have one more that has come through so far, but just want to make sure I get to any others. So submit them through the question box if you do have any. This one I have right now, Alex, do you have any advice on how to position the results of a network assessment?
That's a great question. We actually have a whole set of what's the right word? I think I'm kind of stumbling here. We have a whole kit around network assessments that we're launching around IT Nation. So stay tuned for that. We'll have a network assessment guide, a best practices around positioning the results, other services that you could layer in on top of Auvik. So for example, if you find out that the firmware is wildly out of date, well, then make that a recommendation. That could be a service that you could do as a one-off at a fee, or you can bundle it into that managed services agreement if they decide to move ahead. So we have a whole ton of collateral we're just about to launch, so stay tuned on that.
Cool. Thank you so much. That does look like it was all the questions that we did have. So I just want to thank you so much again, Alex, for taking the time to present today and answer the questions that came through. Just a reminder to all of you guys on the call today, we will be sending out the presentation slides as well as a recording. Look out for that in the coming days, likely tomorrow. And enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.